Away. Here we go. Right. Can everyone just give me a quick thumbs up so I can check you can see the slides okay? And that's working marvelous. Well, I should start by just, reiterating what Robin said there. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time to listen to us rattle on. And we really do hope you leave this little hour with us feeling inspired and uplifted in some way. That would be great. So my name's Russell Pearson, and I'm a deputy head here at Willowbrook School in Exeter. Best job in the world, and love being in this incredible school. And I run a podcast and have written a book with my really good friend Steve, who's on your screen as well.
Hello.
And we've been friends for a long time, and we'll give you a little bit of a backstory to that because it's quite key as to why we've done the things we've done and why we've got to this point that we're producing a book and so on. We've got no idea whether any of you coming on today have heard the podcast before or whatever else, but if you haven't, that's fine. And if you have, that's wonderful. But hopefully, whatever your kind of experience of us is, you'll come away feeling a bit uplifted and that you've learned a few things today. That'd be really good. So let's tell you the story of how our little partnership came about, really. And Steve, I'm going to pass over to you because you didn't go straight into teaching, did you? You had a career that was a bit different first.
I did. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Russell's correct. Teaching was my second career. After ending the A-level process at school, I actually went on to do a law degree and was fortunate enough to pursue my initial ambition of being a solicitor, and I always wanted to work in family and criminal law, and that is what I did. In the back of my mind, there was definitely scope to be a teacher because my mum had been a TA for almost 30 years, and I had an inkling and an understanding of what teaching was like, and it wasn't all about the holidays, it was far beyond that, but I had this passion for wanting to follow my mum's footsteps into education, but always knew I wanted to be a lawyer first. So I ended up working for a legal practice in Kent, and from there I was actually fortunate enough to get a secondment to Australia to work in Melbourne as a solicitor over there for a year, and that gave me a great insight into a different culture, a different way of life, a different legal practice. And it was actually whilst I was in Australia that I had a really telling moment where I was working on a very tricky court case involving abuse, and one of my clients was a young boy who I was working for, and he had been subject to the horrors of the world. And just as we were about to go into the legal courtroom, he turned to me and said, "I'm okay." And I stopped in my own tracks and thought, okay, well, I'm going to be his comfy and to support you. And he told me how he listened to Elton John, "I'm Still Standing," every night, because that gave him the strength to carry on. And it was at this moment, I just remember the penny dropping, thinking, I want to work with children so much more. I want to help support, nurture, and really work for children to give them the opportunities they have. So after coming back from Australia, I quickly applied for my PGCE, ended up doing that at Canterbury, Christchurch in Kent, and then started my process of entering the education ladder and working my way up. And as Russell was just put on the screen, I was really lucky to join a school that was only a year old, and I started there as my NQT. To this day, I'm still not sure if I was the actual candidate my head teacher wanted, because I remember arriving on the first day buzzing, and she said, "Brilliant, I'm so glad I've got a passionate IT practitioner." And I thought, oh, I'm modern foreign language specialist. I don't know if she actually meant me. But anyway, I was smiling and I was joyful to have the opportunity. And it was really short time after that actually I was given a joint role, because as NQT, I couldn't just begin with IT, but I began leading that for the school. And we were a really innovative hub in Kent. And the aim was always to be a school that other schools could access and learn about how you could use video conferencing, way beyond before Zoom came up, how you could use iPads effectively. And we were really rolling with this passion for IT. And it just gave me that taster into what it would be like to lead a subject. This over time crept up, and as the years progressed, I started to work as a middle leader, being a key stage leader as well. And that is where Russ and I first engaged as a leadership team, alongside one other middle leader who was amazing and kept us in check. And then as we progressed further down the line, the opportunities for senior leadership came up, and Russell was assistant head teacher, and I was fortunate enough to join him on the senior leadership team to be another part-time assistant head teacher. So that's enough about me initially. I'll pass back to Russell because he had a different journey completely, which is equally as fascinating to me.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So while you were being a very interesting grown-up and traveling the world and going to Australia and being a solicitor, I decided after my English literature degree that I would go straight into teaching, kind of thanks to my, fiance at the time, who said, you need to sort yourself out and get on a PGCE. If you're going to do something in teaching, you kind of need to be proactive and make it happen. So I did. And I've never looked back. I went and worked at a school called Warrenwood Community Primary, which was just 20 minutes away from where Steve was at Dartford Bridge. And it was an interesting start to my career because I got my job in the April, and the school had a category called Notice to Improve. And my tutors at university said, what are you doing? You shouldn't be trying to go and work in a school that is in these kind of circumstances at the start of your career. Well, most of my tutors said that. And one said, Russell, now's the time to do it. You're going to learn loads. You're going to love it. You're going to get loads of cool experiences working somewhere really challenging at the start of your career. And once you've had kids and things, you're not going to want this kind of school. So I was like, all right, that sounds good. I was a bit of a yes man. I was kind of, let's go for it. So I got that job, was feeling really excited, turned up for my first day of work in September to be greeted by someone from the local authority who said, sorry to break it to you, Russell, but over the summer, the school went into special measures, the head teacher was removed, and I'm the acting head for the next few months. Nice to meet you. I hope you get off to a good start. So it was a bit of a scary beginning to my teaching career, and they had to make an exception letting me work in special measures schools in NQT because they don't normally let you do that. But I learned loads there. And one of the things that typically happens in a special measures school is you get lots of opportunities early on that you probably wouldn't in a school that was a bit more settled. So opportunities for leadership, opportunities to develop. And before I knew it, I'd developed this taste for maths, which was ironic because I used to hate maths, and that became my thing. I was put on a maths specialist course by my head teacher and made maths subject leader. So that was very nice and developed a real passion for maths, and that's been a thread throughout my whole career. After 3 and a bit years working in that kind of environment, you start to lose your sanity and think, I want to know what a normal school feels like. And this job opportunity came up for middle leadership at Dartford Bridge Community Primary School, which, as Steve said, was quite a new school, 20 minutes down the road. And it was good, according to Ofsted. And I just thought it'd be quite nice to go and experience what a normal school is, where things are just okay. So I went there. Oh, one bit I've missed here is that I became assessment lead as well while in that first school. And I should say at this point that I really hate data and still do. But what I really hate is data used really ineffectively and loads of it for no reason. So I'd also become assessment lead. I moved to Steve's school as maths subject leader. They were looking for middle leaders in English and maths. So I took on maths. And as Steve's described really well there, we became middle leaders together and really gelled. And we enjoyed, one of the things about this partnership that we really enjoyed is Steve and I were going through the same mistakes and errors of leadership at the same time. And it was really fun having a distraction when you mucked up of someone else that was also mucking up that you could focus on. So we learned loads from each other and talked a lot and shared good practice between us. I became an assistant head, and Steve followed shortly after, and we had some time there at the school where we were both stepping into senior leadership, running full phases of the school, learning loads, and just having a whale of a time. This took a dark turn for Steve, not so much for me, when I decided I was going to relocate down to Devon, to the southwest. We always say broke his heart at this point. And that was because, young family, where I lived in Medway and Kent just wasn't really where I saw kind of bringing up my 2 little girls. And an opportunity came up at school in Torquay, Cockington Primary Large 3-form entry primary school, as an assistant head with a head teacher who I really hit it off with when I first moved down there, and where I first went down to meet him. I thought, this is where I want to be. So Steve, I'm going to hand back to you to find out what you were doing while I had relocated to Devon.
Yes, whilst Russell was enjoying the luxuries of the coast, I was still at Dartford Bridge, and actually we were undergoing some slight change there as well when the initial head teacher had left after nearly 10 years in charge, and we were restructuring as such. And that presented the opportunity to myself to actually go from assistant head teacher to deputy head teacher after a pretty grueling interview process, but I was fortunate enough to get the position, and that really saw me develop my own strategies and my own way of being within the school, because having started as an NQT and worked your way up to deputy head teacher, relationships with our staff would change, naturally dynamics would change as the whole school responsibility was a lot bigger, and I'd lost my right-hand man. I didn't have that person that when I mucked up I could turn to, because he was so far away in Devon. But nevertheless, it was a brilliant opportunity, one that I'll always be thankful for, and actually it saw me grow so much as a leader. But I was really missing conversation with Russell. I was really missing having someone to talk about the finer details of education and just geek out about it, really. And that is where we then proceeded to our next step.
Thanks, Steve. So shortly after Steve became a deputy head, I followed suit. And after a few years at Cockington Primary, lovely job opportunity came up here at Willowbrook School. And it was the best move I ever made. I've never been happier in a school. Well, maybe when we were working together, Steve, you know. But yeah, and you know, what I was really dying to do is to have that experience of leading across a whole school in an assistant head role. Was very much looked after phases or upper school, and I really wanted to know my nursery children as much as my year sixes, which I do now, but I didn't a few years back. And I should just say, as a little side note here, it was our head teacher that Steve said moved on during his deputy, or just before his deputy headship, that nicknamed us the dynamic duo when we worked together, because we just seemed to really hit it off and work well together. So that's where that Dynamic Deps name came from. Yeah, Steve messaged me in 2018 one summer saying, Russell, I really miss our chats about school and work, and we've both just stepped into deputy headship. Wouldn't it be cool to collaborate again? You know, this is the modern world. We can do stuff online. And he suggested that we started up a Facebook group. So we did that. At the time, we called it Make an Impact Education, but now it's called Dynamic Deputies Facebook group. We started up a Twitter, and he had the idea of a podcast. And I was like, Steve, what's a podcast? I don't even know what a podcast is. And apparently it's where you just record yourself chatting to somebody and you hope other people will log on and listen. Podcasts are huge now and really popular with lots of people. But a few years ago, it was still a really new thing for us. We had never even listened to one, if I'm absolutely honest. But we like the idea of chatting about education, recording it. And if someone listened, great. We're really privileged in that we started in 2018, and just this month we've passed 100,000 listens to the podcast. So we've got a really nice following of regular listeners now, which is just blows my mind. And they don't come on to listen to us; they come to listen to our amazing guests who we share their insights and their wisdom about the world of education. And we always say we're just so lucky because we speak to people from all over the country, well, over the in the world, and they're people who. Typically, if you went to see them at a conference, you pay hundreds of pounds to see, and we get an hour of their time 2-to-1 to interrogate them, ask them about things that matter to us. And while we really hope it benefits our listeners, rather selfishly, we're asking about things that we need to know in our roles and our positions. So it's always been about our own professional learning. And what we started to do was to say, my goodness, like our heads are full of so much of this learning and this knowledge that we've absorbed from people. Wouldn't it be amazing to capture that somewhere? And around that time, about a year ago, we were approached by a publisher about the prospect of putting some of these ideas into a book. And that's where this book, Talking Teaching with the Dynamic Deputies, Inspiring CPD for Every Teacher, has come from. It is a collection of just some of the knowledge and the collective wisdom we've absorbed from talking to and meeting lots of amazing people in the profession. So thank you for indulging us for the first 10 or so minutes about our backgrounds. That's the boring bit, done, but I think it's quite nice for you to have a bit of context about how we came about meeting each other and writing a book. On to the next slide then. So we've made this book and there are 10 chapters in it. I appreciate the text is probably a bit small there on your screens, but there are 10 themes that we've picked that are inspired by episodes of the podcast. And just glancing down that, we hope some of those things are appealing to you. We try to, hopefully this is the first of a few books. We'll see how well it does, but we really wanted to pick themes that would be relevant, whether you were in your first year of teaching and just coming out of college, or whether you had been doing this 20 odd years, or you're an experienced deputy or a head. It doesn't matter. These are themes that are relevant, whatever your experience. So we've put together chapters on these themes. And what we do in each chapter is we use quotations from the podcast episode, but then we really unpick what that person was saying in a bit more depth. And that's where it is a different offer to the podcast, I think, is our own reflections, where we go into that in a little bit more depth and elaborate on these quotations from the podcast. What you then get at the end of each chapter is a reflection from both me and Steve, very much a personal reflection. And you don't get time for that in the podcast. You get little snippets of our thoughts about things, but most of the time we're listening and letting our guests speak. In the book, you get a lot more of our insights. You get little anecdotes from the classroom and things that we've learned about as both teachers and leaders. So for the sake of today's presentation, and conscious that we've got about 45 more minutes together, we've picked just 3 of those chapters we're going to talk to you a little bit about. And for each of those chapters, about 10 to 15 minutes, just telling you a bit more about that chapter, the guests we met. And Steve and I are just going to have a bit of a chat like we would in the podcast. So you can just listen in. But if during that chat you've got like a burning question or something comes to mind, please put it in the chat. And if we don't answer it straight away, we'll have a little look at it later in the presentation. So let's have a look. The 3 things we've picked to talk to you about are these 3 things here. So chapter 1, everyday heroes, inclusive practice, chapter 4, and differentiation, which is chapter 9. And Steve, everyday heroes was based on an interview we did with this incredible lady, which I'm sure some of you watching have heard of, but if you haven't, that's fine. This is Jazz Ampafar. And I've put a little snippet there from her about me, because every chapter, I should have said this, starts with a personal reflection from that person about their career to date, which is really nice. So you kind of get to know them a little bit. And Steve, I don't know if you want to summarize a bit of information about Jazz and who she is.
Absolutely. And what I must say right now is that Russell has the finest eye for selecting a guest at the most perfect time. And Jazz was one of those people, because I had known her previously for A, being on The Apprentice, and B, she did a TED talk that I'd seen on training a couple of years prior to us talking to Jazz. And it really hit home, because Jazz, will not mind us saying, she came from a story of poverty. She had had a really, really difficult childhood and upbringing. And it was going through that adversity that actually made her who she was today. She went on to be a teacher, then a keynote speaker, and she helps so many people around the world. And actually, we spoke to Jazz just as the first lockdown hit. So in my mind, I was clouded with uncertainty. I was going into school with very limited children there, and it all felt quite overwhelming. But then to have this 1 hour with Jazz at that moment in time was so uplifting. She really explained how teaching is that profession that can have such a profound impact. And after being locked down, but suddenly hearing this wonderful view, Russell, I think you'll agree with me, she was a beacon of light, wasn't she?
That's a lovely way of describing it. It was at a time when we were all just like thrown into this complete uncertainty, as you said, and to have someone who, she said something really interesting in the podcast, which was that as a child, she described herself as a chaos navigator. You know, she was used to navigating chaos on a daily basis. And she said, the whole world has just been thrown into my world now. You know, you're all chaos navigators now. Lots of you have had it kind of easy or simple. And now everyone knows what it's like to navigate chaos. And I thought that was such a great point. And so many of her learning curves over the years, she was sharing in that podcast as a source of wisdom for the listeners at that time. And yeah, it was a hugely popular episode at the time. And there's no wonder, you know, she's an incredible person. So what we'll share with you now is some of the quotations, some of the things she said in that episode, and we're just going to have a bit of a chat about them in the way that we do in the book itself. So it's called Everyday Heroes, this podcast episode in this chapter, because Jazz uses this term a lot to describe 5 teachers who made an enormous difference to her life. So she very much, you know, she strongly believes that she'd be dead if it wasn't for meeting teachers who made such a difference to her life. And one of the things she likes to emphasize to her listeners when she speaks live is these people weren't superheroes in the way we imagine. They weren't over the top and amazing, flamboyant teachers. She calls them everyday heroes because of the simple things they did that made such a difference to her life. So this first quotation, she says, it's the glimmers of light, the smiles, it's the smallest acts of kindness. It's the true connection people make. It's the assuming the best rather than assuming the worst. Now, Steve, I know in our careers, making that connection with children has been really, really important. I don't know what your reflections are on that.
It was exactly that, Russell. And Jazz is so correct. It's the smallest acts. It's those tiny, a smile on the gate, a smile at the door, a thumbs up to a child who's just maybe looking a little bit cautious. You know, it's those tiny little elements that we can not even see in ourselves and we can take for granted, but actually they all help in forming a relationship with the children. And I know from going as an NQT, I always thought, oh yeah, I want to be the friends teacher. I'd worked with extreme vulnerability in my previous profession. I just wanted to be a friend, and that wasn't necessarily the right perception to go into school thinking I could be the friend with these children, but it wasn't just that. It was just making sure that children knew that you cared about them and you knew them for who they were. It was looking at beyond seeing a child as a higher ability, a lower ability, or a middle ability. It was scrapping that. It was knowing them for who they were. And you could do this by just doing these tiny little acts that they would take for granted. And then we know that children will work harder for us if there's a brilliant rapport there. So it's not being fake about it. It's just having those small acts of kindness.
Yeah, and I had a great conversation with my assistant head today, who, for no real reason, well, there are good reasons, which I'll go into in a moment. She's got a particular pupil who's just really kind of latched onto her, really trusts her and comes to find her every day. And she's like, "What is it? What have I done? Like, why? Not in a bad way, but what have I done to sort of warrant this connection?" I said, "You're kind. That's it. You're kind." And she sees it in every time you interact with that child. She senses this genuine care for her. And something that we'll talk about in the next quotation to do with that authenticity that we need to have in the it's a couple of quotations later, but that authentic relationship that we have with children, that they really sense that true nature of us when we connect with them from who we really are, and we really see to who they really are. And that bit she said about assuming the best, she said, I was always in enough trouble as it was at school to have teachers actually see the best in me and assume that I'm not trying to cause trouble or do something wrong. That really shifted my mindset when I was dealing with vulnerable children after this interview, that I would take that time to pause and think, are they trying to do something wrong? Are they trying to make my life difficult? No, I'm going to always look for the best in our young people, because they sense the adults that really do look for that in them, and those that don't. So Steve, she then goes on and she is talking about some of these 5 everyday heroes. And one of them is Mrs. Cook, who was a teacher she talks about really fondly. And Jazz Ampafar says, Mrs. Cook used to ask us, who are you going to be when you grow up? Not what are you going to do, but who are you going to be? And she tells the story of them sat around on the carpet and Mrs. Cook asking this question. And there's 2 bits, Steve. Do you remember? The first one was how one of the little boys on the carpet answered this question.
Yeah, and he said, I want to be a dad.
Yeah, and she says in the podcast, well, then all the other children started laughing. And she said, Mrs. Cook just paused the cast and said, no, don't ever put someone else's dream down. If you want to be a dad, you can be a dad. That's a brilliant dream. And then she asks Jazz, what do you want? Who are you going to be? And Jazz, do you remember what Jazz says, Steve?
I want to be like you, Mrs. Cook.
Yeah, she says, I want to be like you. And she says that in that moment, she just felt completely embarrassed, like it just came out. And she said most teachers in that situation would go all gushing, oh, that's so lovely, thank you. And she said, but Mrs. Cook just stared her straight in the eye and said, great, you're going to be a brilliant educator one day. And she said, and there's a lovely metaphor she uses, she says, it's like she tied a golden rope around me, tied it to a stake and hammered it into the future. So like at that moment, I knew that that's what I was going to go on and be. And, Jazz is the most extreme example of the impact teachers can make. But I just think so often we forget, particularly at the moment when we're all so tired and stressed, and working in schools is just harder than it's ever been. That's why I'm so grateful some of you have turned up today, that, to just remember that even at times like this, these small acts of kindness, the belief we show in our children is changing lives. Even amidst this chaos, you are transforming what children think they can do with themselves in the future. Is phenomenal. So that takes me on to a quotation that I was sort of referring to earlier with that word authentic. She says, I'm talking about being professionally vulnerable and personally authentic. It is not what you get paid for, and it's not in the teacher standards. And Steve, I love this because you said earlier, it's not about me, trying to be their friend. That's what I thought when I started my career, that I had to buddy up with them, or I had to be cool, or whatever else. She's talking about just being professionally vulnerable and personally authentic. What does that mean to you?
Well, what it doesn't mean, Russ, is that also in the morning, if I've had a massive fallout at home, I don't come to work and wear my heart on the sleeve and let everyone know that I've been so authentic that I'm in a terrible state. But what it is not as well is fakeness. And children are so good at seeing through maybe a fake approach to life. You've got to remember that some of these children may have had real difficult trust issues during their life outside of school. So when they come to school and they want to have a relationship with their teacher or their staff, then they're knowing how to spot authenticity. They know how people have a real caring heart, and they know how the approach to talking to them will go for it. Like your assistant head teacher, kindness, and that is the stuff that's not written down on paper, and that's not in the teacher standards. It's definitely not what we get paid for, but being that kind of human and having that human connection with children goes such a long way, and that is professional and personal authenticity.
Awesome. And I find it funny because I've heard teachers quite a lot of the time saying, teaching, it's a bit of an act, really. And on one level, I get what people mean by that, in that, yes, if I've had an argument at home that morning, I'm not going to come in and wear that on my sleeve, and I need to sort of put on a brave face and so on. But the idea that the whole thing's an act really doesn't appeal to me in my job, and I think when I started teaching, I felt like, I had to have this kind of ego of I'm in charge and I'm in control and I'm the teacher. And what that's kind of fallen away over the years. And what I find now is I'm just my genuine self. And one of the things I love about the school I work in now is I feel like everyone's like that. And that's what drew me to this place. And I came here and I came for an interview and I thought I'll be myself. And then I got the job. And then now, in my daily work with children, I am just myself, and I feel they're drawn to that. And what's beautiful about my school, and I welcome anyone to come and visit us if you ever want to, is every adult is like that in their relationships with children. There's a genuine human connection, and it goes such a long way in terms of those children's loyalty to us as an organisation and to what we do. Moving on to her final quotation, we asked Jazz, we hear a lot about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. As a child that had those adverse childhood experiences, what would have been the best offer for you growing up? And she said, I'm really glad you asked that. She said, it's not about you fixing my trauma, and that's not your job. But as a teacher, what you can do is, here's my own acronym of ACE: authenticity, consistency, embedded high expectations. And we've talked about authentic relationships there. But Steve, consistency and high expectations, what does that mean to you?
I think we know that for some children, away from school is possibly the hardest time, because they have no routine, they have no high expectations. There's this element of freedom where they can do it. And we do not want to have an, oh, bless them approach to life. Like, oh, they're finding it hard, we won't expect as much, because actually children feel so secure and safe when they have such consistency, they have such high expectations. And it's treating everyone equally, fairly and justly. I've worked with the younger year groups all the way to year 6, and I know, particularly by the time they get to upper key stage 2, children have this concept of justice and fairness and how people are treated in class. Now, if we can be that consistent person, we treat them all the same, value them all the same, and have such high expectations, and they go hand in hand. Like, we've got this caring approach and we've got this high expectations. Children respect that. They respect that, and they learn from that, and they want that in their lives. So that's all we can do. Be that person who has this approach to life and to schooling, where we have that consistent high approach to what they need to be doing.
And I'm so glad you said that, Steve, because when I went into senior leadership, I was really passionate that I'd be a leader who could show that you can run a school that is loving and warm and caring and nurturing, and also has real rigor and high expectations and higher standards for their children. And I'd started to doubt in my career whether you could have both. Did you have to be an exam factory to get good results where it was cold? And I can see schools out there that work like that. Or did I have to opt to be the nice, fluffy school, but then the results wouldn't be there? I absolutely believe with passion now that the two are compatible, and actually it's an expression of our love and compassion and care for the children to have those high expectations. I do children no positive service, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, if I allow their story of their background to be the reason they can't go on and succeed. It's legitimate, and it's important to acknowledge, and we have to understand the barriers that are going to be there for children who have had tough times growing up and who continue to face adversity. But it's an expression of our care for those children when we have high expectations, and children feel safe, as you said, and secure within a framework of high expectations and clear routines, calm adults. So we wanted to start with this chapter, Everyday Heroes, and some insights from that, because I think it really hammers home the amazing work that you do in your schools every day, and how those little things that you do make such a difference. And Steve, I'm just going to go on now to the sort of section of the chapter, which would be our reflection. And what we've done for today's presentation, for each one, we've either shared a snippet of my reflection or Steve's. And this first one's a snippet from mine. And Steve, would you mind sharing that for people?
Of course. No, I don't mind at all. This is Russell's reflection. This is what it said. Imagine being that child who's lived through some of the really tough stuff. Perhaps you were that child. And now imagine that the same child goes to school each day, only to find every adult who speaks to them does so in such a way that empowers them to believe that their future success is absolutely possible. That's the kind of school I work in and the kind of place I will always want to be. Now, Russell, first of all, when I read that, I said to you straight away, did this culture exist before you went to that school? Is it something you've worked on, developed over time? And how did you get everyone on board with this?
Well, what I'm really proud to say is that this school has always had an incredible heart, and that's what drew me to Willowbrook School. And I was talking to one of my colleagues recently who's been here for many, many years, who said, you know, that's been something about this school that's always been special. We've always cared. We've always had that kind of team ethos with the staff. And, you know, that's beautiful to hear. And when I came to visit, that was just something I saw. I think where we've really improved is how that can lead to a really aspiration and go hand in hand with that really aspirational culture. But this point about every adult that, you know, children encounter, I always try and visualize it from the perspective of a child. So, you know, I've got my backpack on and I walk through the school gates. The first person I see might be the head teacher or the deputy head or an assistant head. So they smile at me. Do they say good morning? Do they make me feel welcome? Do I feel like I belong? And there's a chapter on belonging that leads on from this very nicely in the book. Do I then, you know, when I get to the class door, the TA or the teacher that sees me first in that moment of the day, what's that reaction like? I stand on gate duty sometimes, and I've hopefully been that first warm good morning. And I watch them go into classes, and I see one of our TAs or someone wrap their arm around some kid and make them smile and make them feel good. And I just think, yeah, I'm sometimes half in tears just watching the staff, because they've got such a warmth about the way they interact with children. You can't fake that. It comes from a really deep place of caring about young people. But just imagine now that child goes through their whole day and they have 7, 8, 9 interactions with different people, whether that be, you know, someone in the office, someone in the lunch hall, and every person talks to them as if they can, you know, they're great, that they can do something with their life. Over time, the cumulative effect of that is profound. So, you know, this chapter on Everyday Heroes is about celebrating the power of the work you do and recognizing how those, what we often think of as little things, are making a real difference day in, day out. I'm going to move on, Steve, for time. And the second chapter we'll talk to you about is about inclusive practice with this chap called Gareth Morwood. And as the description says here, I won't read it all, but Gareth is currently part of an organisation called Studio 3, which does lots of kind of consultancy work in SEN. But he was a teacher for 25 years in the secondary sector and 17 years as Senko. So he's got some brilliant experience. And, you know, you can just see from his smile there, he's a lovely guy, Gareth. We call him the nicest person on Twitter. And a real encourager. And we'd heard a few YouTube videos and things have been talking about inclusive practice. We're like, we've got to talk to this guy. We love what he's about. So we did, and let's share some of the insights from that fantastic interview with such a great guy. So we're both passionate about inclusive practice, and, you know, definitely, Steve, in my school you walk in, we take all children. Well, you have, you know, everyone's obliged to take all children, but not everyone makes them feel welcome. And in our school, we really, really do, whatever their needs or their background. And a lot of what Gareth said just, it really resonated with me. So the first thing he talks about, Steve, is actually just what a complex environment schools are. He says the environments and contexts which we're asking young people to learn and engage with and understand are very complex. And he's thinking about all children there, but actually children with additional needs. Just recognizing how complex schools are for children. I don't know what you think about that.
They're hugely complex. You've got to think that some children come from as a home where they're the only child there, and then suddenly they're in a class of 30. Even entering an exiting school, I know we just said it could be like such a wonderful experience, but for some children, having those rules and routines, like knowing when to walk along the corridor, knowing to run on the playground, knowing to talk in class when the time is right, but also to be silent, knowing to go in the lunch hall and that you can talk there, but you've also got to eat your lunch, you've got to go out by a certain time. There's so much. I'm talking fast because it snowballs for a day, and you think for certain children, the overload and the overwhelming factors of what it can be is huge. Doesn't matter if you're in EYFS, if you're in primary school or secondary school, there's so much to the environment of a school, let alone the actual environment within a classroom itself, with that ethic on the walls or down the corridors, posters, etc. There is so much that we're looking at from a child's perspective that sometimes it's really good to step back and actually look at the environment that a child is in.
Definitely. And that was kind of starting point for the podcast. stop and recognize what are all the things a child walking into your school has to get their head around. And Steve's described that really well in terms of both the routines and the rules and things, but also the physical environment of all those different spaces in. It's really easy to forget how distressing it can be for some of our learners to adapt to all those different environments throughout the day, and how different that is to their home environment. And I've thought a lot recently about those children who become school refusers, and often it can look like, oh, the parents just don't care and they're not bothering and so on. But so often for children with additional needs, it's this overwhelming anxiety about the complexity they're going to have to face when they get to school. And one little thing that goes wrong in that cog of their day, whether that be an adult that changes the rules all of a sudden, or an environment that is really triggering, or raises their arousal levels, can be enough for them to not want to come to that school building. So again, seeing things from the perspective of the child, what are we asking of them in the day? For some children, that's a breeze. For some of our children, that's super overwhelming. So moving on from that, one of the really key bits of that podcast that is just a really important message with inclusive practice. He says, if you think about what's a good strategy for young people who have a diagnosis, additional needs, who have had difficult starts in life, or perhaps are in care, these are good strategies for everybody. And this is a really nice thing in the podcast. Some of the things and the principles we talk about, Steve, it's so important to recognize that inclusive practice isn't about having to do a few bolt-ons that benefit some children. These are good quality first practices that benefit everybody, aren't they?
Yeah, good practice can work for everyone. So we should be doing that. And I know I spoke about visual timetables because even in my class of year 6, it didn't matter if they were the high flyers or whoever they were. Actually, it didn't matter as well. If you had a visual timetable on a desk or in front of the classroom, that helped everybody, because anxiety can be very visual. It can also be very hidden. And children like to know what's coming next. We just spoke about rules and routines. Well, actually, the setup for the day is vitally important. If you can see in front of you as a scaffolded list, I love lists and I know it helps me. So if you can see as a classroom pupil, you go, right, okay, so this is what was in before break. Then we've got another 2 subjects, lunch, and then 2 in the afternoon. That helps everybody and can relax everyone. And it's that atmosphere that we're creating, that culture within a classroom. And the more relaxed it is, the better the learning environment is as well. So let's not appreciate that it just helps children with additional needs. It can help everybody in that classroom.
Well, I don't know about you, Steve, but the first thing I do as deputy head, if I'm not in class all day, is I go in, I open my laptop and I look at my timetable for the day, I look at my diary, and that gives me a sense of purpose, focus and calm, knowing what I've got ahead. So if I feel like that as a 21-year-old man, then they must feel that in bags as young, vulnerable people, but they benefit everybody for sure. Yeah. So they're moving on from that principle of inclusive practices benefit everybody, and your visual timetable is a really nice example of that, and we mention a few others in the book. Is this idea that when we're talking about additional needs, so we had a discussion in the podcast about autism and ADHD, for example. Gareth was really keen to say this. He says the key is really focusing on the individual. It's not about saying that's a 12-year-old with ADHD. It's about knowing that that's Alex or Ahmed or Sarah. Everyone's unique. And Steve, I know you don't mind me mentioning that what people might not realize is, as a child, you had a diagnosis of ADHD yourself, didn't you? And, I just wondered how that comment that he made resonated with you in terms of your experience going through the education system.
Perfectly. And I remember that when I first got my diagnosis at 9 years of age, I lived in Norfolk, and I remember the doctor telling my mum that whilst I'll be going on to medication to support me, which was not that common at the time, he just said, look, you're lucky you live around farms and you live in fields. Go for runs all the time, go for runs, because this is part of you now, you've got to deal with it. But actually, schooling, and when I moved down to the southeast, I loved it, because I remember going into my new school being incredibly nervous and just being welcomed for who I was, not being welcomed for a child that might need some extra support in class to settle in or anything. I was just welcomed as a new pupil, and it really made me flourish during education to think, I am me. It doesn't matter who I am. This is part of me, and that will go forward with me. Now, I've also got a stepson who's got ASD and ADHD. So I know from a parenting view how important this is, that he's not seen as someone who has this and he must sit in a certain place in the classroom and he needs this scaffolding to help him. He is who he is, and we want him to achieve, not with the bolt-on of the fact that he's got ADHD. No, it doesn't matter about that. It's letting him succeed. And sure, we need to scaffold and support correctly, but let's not label him and then use that to a disadvantage. And the fact that he is different to what I was like as a child, like Gareth says, where everyone's unique, and strategies that work for me would never work for Reese at all with different people. So it's accepting someone as new to the table and thinking, what can we do to support that person? Not, they've got this must be the solution. That doesn't work.
That's great reflection, Steve. And, you know, in my role as a deputy head, we've had actually a crazy year at Willowbrook. We've had 50 new children in year, which I've just never experienced in my career. And lots of those have come with different needs and things. And I'm still now, after all these years of teaching, meeting kids and going, well, I've never met one of them before. And, you know, a truly unique individual where, yes, they've got a diagnosis, or, you know, we're told there's this particular area of SEN, but what works for another child with that diagnosis next door or in the other class doesn't work for them. And I do need to get to know them as an individual, because they're not a diagnosis, they are a child. And yes, there are things that are common to some of those diagnoses that we need to understand and anticipate, but actually really taking that time to get to know the individual is so key. And that's something in the primary world we're really lucky that we have a bit more space and capacity to do. But I just think that's so important to look beyond that label. And we did another recent inclusion episode with Ellie Chappell, didn't we, about inclusion. And Ellie Chappell, if you don't know her, has a daughter who's deaf-blind. She has all sorts of complexities in terms of her physical health. But Ellie spoke about her for about 20 minutes before we even mentioned her diagnosis, because Ellie sees beyond the labels that come with her daughter's sort of physical conditions, and is so keen that the world sees beyond those labels, and that actually there's just a beautiful and incredible child there. And that's the case for all the children you work with, including those with diagnoses. So moving on from that idea of really valuing the individual, we loved this bit of the podcast. We were talking about how we best support children with these additional, with additional needs. And Gareth was really keen to point us inwards and say, well, look at yourself as an educator. If you're stressed as an individual, you're not only going to limit what you're able to do with the young people, but you're highly likely to pass that stress on. The time to plan is when people are calm, not when people are in crisis. He's sort of saying two things there. But that first bit there, Steve, about how our stress can translate onto the other children, I guess staff as well around us when we're dealing with young people. We've seen that lots, haven't we?
And I have made many a mistake in how I've dealt with young people, particularly in the early years. My first class had two really incredibly complex individuals, ASD, ADHD, and other attributes. Now, I know that being new to the profession, I found it difficult to manage those situations. And for sure, my stress was very visible to children. And that it's like I'm passing it on to everyone else in the classroom. And actually, this is another time where we've got to stand back. We've got to reevaluate how we can manage situations and learn to adapt to situations. Because like Gareth has said, the more that we are stressed and the more internalized this becomes, worked up, absolutely, that gets passed on to children, and it's snowball effect. It really does. So Russ, I know you've got a fantastic metaphor about this as well.
Oh, well, yeah, we talk a lot in our school, well, a few of us do, about this metaphor of the snow globe. If you imagine your brain, when you're stressed, that just being really shaken up, and how, in that state, you get no clarity, you can't even see through the thing. Yet when you let things just calm and settle, you're able to see things for what they are. And I think our thinking and our stress levels are like that, in that, when we allow ourselves to settle, we cope and we deal with children in such a better way. And there are times where that's really hard, and actually we just have to deal with what's in front of us. But I know there have been numerous occasions where maybe I've taken a little breath before I've had that interaction with a child, or I've responded to something, and I've dealt with it in such a better way because I've taken that moment to recognize where I am at. Equally, there have been times where I've actually drawn on others' help and said, I'm a bit concerned. I'm going to say the wrong thing here, or I'm going to escalate this situation. Would you step in and deal with this? And I have to do that sometimes with my assistant heads and vice versa. So it's all about having a teamwork ethos in your school where everyone's recognizing each other's kind of stress and where we're at in our emotional states, and being really empathetic towards others. And I don't know about you, Steve, but when I am around other people who are in their own sea of calm, it definitely has a calming effect on me. So that's something that's really key in this part of the podcast. I'd love to talk about it a little bit more, but we need to move on for time. But yeah, being really conscious of your own stress levels when dealing with young people. Steve, I'm going to read your reflection here, because you were thinking in your reflection on this chapter about your classroom. And guys, when I went to work at Dartford Bridge, I was rubbish at displays. Stephen wound me up about it for years because mine was shocking, but he nailed it. And he'd get his mum, who's a TA, to come in the summer holidays and set it up. And this is his reflection about the displays. And I feel like we've come full circle because he's finally realized I was right to have boring displays. And he was just overwhelming his young people. Let me read it for you. He says, another reflection that's pertinent here is how I set up my classroom. I'm the first to admit that having a new classroom to decorate and to set up was always a huge buzz for me. I love spending summer holidays creating a theme for the class, designing wall art, even creating Shrek's swamp or the Gruffalo's woods in his classroom. I can remember that, including tree trunks for seats and bark all over the floor. And he warned you about how that bark goes a bit smelly with underfloor heating. Anyway, I let my passion for design dictate the classroom layout rather than considering the needs of the 30 children who would have to use it. I quickly adapted my practice as I became better accustomed to the needs of my classes. Gareth's so right when he discusses the need for a safe, consistent and calming environment. So Steve, there's nothing wrong with having a lovely looking classroom, but you definitely stripped it back over the few years, didn't you, as you thought about
100%. And I remember my own partner walking in, looking at my displays and saying, to her, it looked like someone had been sick on the walls because I had so much up there. I had the 100 higher frequency words that they must learn by the end of the year. I had every times table in the area. I had science displays, DT displays, RE displays. There was so much. But to me, I thought it looked beautiful. And I was like, this is so colourful and vibrant. But actually, what I'd failed to acknowledge was that I was actually doing this for me. And we were quite a competitive school, still were. And some people even had buses, like literal made out of wood buses in their book corners. So it was one of these high level competitions to make your classroom amazing. But were we catering for every child in that classroom? No, not really. We weren't creating the safe, consistent and calm space. It was actually, I mean, it couldn't have been calm with such a vibrancy around it that it was so in your face. But I had to step back and I had to strip it back, like you said. And Gareth was so on the money when he said, actually, is that what we were aiming for? No, we're not aiming for that with the classroom. We're looking for a space that enhances and enables children to learn to the best of their ability. So we need to consider the needs of the class. We need to consider the needs of the year group and the school, because actually what we want to do is ensure that we are welcoming in our stature, in our person, and that the classroom is set up and designed for the best achievements to be made in there.
Thanks, Steve. That's a great reflection. So on to the final chapter we're going to share a little insight with you about, and it's this chapter on differentiation with the incredible Mary Myatt. If you haven't heard of Mary Myatt, she's just so inspirational, brilliant speaker, and talks at lots of events. So it's highly likely you might have heard of her or one of her books. She's written a whole list of books there. Experienced advisor, writer and speaker, originally trained as an RE teacher. And we actually, the episode we did with Mary Myatt wasn't called Differentiation, it was called The Stuff That Matters, and it's one of our most popular episodes to date. And it's because Mary's got an ability to see through all the nonsense that goes on in a school and tell it straight about what's worthwhile, what makes a difference to children, what doesn't. So I really recommend you listen to this episode if you've not heard it before. So it's called The Stuff That Matters, but in it we talk a bit about differentiation, and Mary Myatt goes for it in terms of unpicking some of the traditional forms of differentiation that haven't perhaps been so helpful in schools. And she says this, I'll launch straight into the first quote: differentiation as an idea in principle is a good one, in that we make the curriculum accessible insofar as possible for every child in the classroom. What it got devolved into was, I've got to produce different works for different groups of children. Now, I don't think anyone would argue that the idea of meeting the needs of children in their classrooms is important, and we just talked about inclusive practice. But Mary says that kind of became a lethal mutation, Steve, and it ended up becoming, let's do different work for different kids, different sheets. And at the start of our career, that was rife, wasn't it? I can remember.
11 years ago, I started as an NQT, and I can tell you that having 4, 5, 6 different ways of setting a task for every maths and English lesson was the way that we did it at our school. We had green paper, red paper, orange paper, and children would be really lucky if they started on the red paper and they got to move up to the extension that was the orange paper. You think, I got into work at like 6:30 in the morning to be photocopying so many different tasks, and actually, was that benefit to the children?
Well, that's a great question, Steve, and it leads really nicely into the next quotation, because that's such a good description of what our lives used to be like as teachers at that time. She talks about how this practice was rooted in a misunderstanding about children's ability. She says, why are we talking about children having low ability or teachers saying my lowers? They are your children, sweetheart. They're not your lowers. All we can talk about with any confidence is prior attainment. So this really shook me to the core, because it made me question whether I had fixed views about children's attainment. Now, no one's debating that when a class comes to you at the start of the year, they've got different levels of prior attainment. They've reached different stages in their learning, whether that be on a standardized assessment or whatever else. But she's saying if that becomes your reason to sort of fix their ability in your head, so these are low, these are kind of average, and these are high, you're going to teach to that for the whole year, and you're going to be setting caps all over the place. And when I started teaching, I can literally picture my weekly format for my lesson planning, where I had 3 columns and it said high ability, middle ability, low ability, and children's names stayed in those same boxes. And there's lots of research to show that schools that teach like that consistently over many years, those kids will be in those same boxes 7 years after they first started in those boxes. So she's saying, we can't have that fixed view of children's attainment. Yes, certain children, things come to a little quicker. And I like to think about children as quicker thinkers. There are children in your class that you can think of who spot patterns quickly, whose hand up will be first. But it doesn't mean then they're inherently smarter than everybody else. It means they spot patterns quicker, that they anticipate the answer quicker, they process information quicker. And, we did another podcast, Steve, with Jane Clapp, who's very passionate about inclusive practice. And she talked about how some of the children in her class who are slower thinkers are actually her deeper thinkers. And we did some great CPD in our school in the autumn, where we were looking at some research about think times. And there's some really good research that shows that if you ask a question, and I'm talking the more open-ended question that children need a bit more time on, and you only give them a couple of seconds to answer, you're going to get the same children that put their hands up over and over again. If you're willing to just let that silence hang for 3 to 5 seconds, you're going to get a massive more proportion of children with their hands up, because you're going to have hooked in those children that aren't as quick to spot the pattern, but will have a little think and will go a bit deeper. And then some of their responses are going to be quite profound and amazing to hear, Steve.
No, absolutely. And do you know what, Russ, to make it even worse, I remember I used to have my groups up on the cupboards, literally my highs, middle and lowers. Yeah. And it didn't matter if I then turned it upside down and had my lowers, my middles and my highs. Children knew, and labeling them like that, you're so right. You don't label them, let alone the children are so intuitive and know what's going on in the classroom that they can't avoid that. So let's strip that back. We don't need that, and they are our children. It comes full circle into terms of what Jas said as well. They're just our children, and we're authentic, and we want to see them as children, not as a grade.
And I have to drop in the anecdote. On our Facebook group recently, I shared Steve's reflection from this chapter about traditional groups, and he was talking about that. And one person said, do you know, I actually had a colleague that had fruit names for their maths groups, and the lower ability in inverted commas group were called the plums. And I actually couldn't believe that they called a group the plums. Anyway, so this idea of fixed ability is something we really, it's our view, we really need to move away from. And I know lots of schools have done. But it still exists in lots of places. She says, I find it heartbreaking that we're rationing interesting, demanding work based on what I consider to be flawed notions of ability. I don't know what a child is capable of until they're given interesting and demanding work and supported to get there. And Steve, I know in my reflection, I talk about this, so I won't launch into this in too much depth now, but this idea that we aim high for all learners and we think about how we scaffold them up to that point is absolutely key. So I'm going to hold off on talking about that point now, Steve, just because it comes up in the reflection. And I know we're a bit short for time. And then her final quotation here links to exactly what I'm about to talk about. Children need to be supported, I would argue, primarily through talk in order to enter the domain with everybody else. They don't need a diminished diet. And that leads really beautifully onto my reflection, if you don't mind sharing.
Of course, I don't mind sharing this at all. So when Russell was talking about his reflection, he was talking about scaffolding and said, so if we are going to scaffold so that all children can access the curriculum, how might this look? Here's a list of ideas I've shared with colleagues recently. I didn't make this on my own, but drawn lots of examples I saw shared in blogs and online resources. I should particularly credit Mary Myatt for the blog we mentioned earlier, and also Ashley Booth's blog, Dr. Differentiation, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Challenge, as each of these helped to refine my thinking.
Thanks, Steve. And then there's 8 examples of scaffolding strategies. And actually, back in January, one night we had a podcast guest cancel on us at the last minute, and me and Steve both book out these evenings where we can do a podcast, and when someone cancels on us, it's really disappointing. I said, Steve, I think I've got a podcast for me and you here around scaffolding. In the book I share these 8 scaffolding strategies. So we sat and recorded a conversation about these 8 scaffolding strategies you can see here, and it's gone crazy. I mean, normally episodes with just me and Steve and no guests aren't very popular. They don't want to listen to us, they want to listen to our fantastic guests. But this one has had over 3,000 listens in the last month, and it's been really, really popular because I think it's really practical. And I'm not going to have time in 3 minutes that I've got left to tell you about these 8 strategies, but afterwards, if you are interested in the podcast, along with the other episodes we've shared tonight, if you listen to this one called 8 Scaffolding Strategies, we go into in depth lots of ideas for how these strategies can look in your classroom. And I feel they're a really genuinely good list for how we can aim high for all learners. And just as a slight caveat to all of this, I do believe scaffolding should be our primary form of differentiation. But both me and Steve recognise there are very specific examples of where there is such a specific area of need, or SEN or physical mobility issue if I'm in PE or something, where a child does need something actually different to the rest of the class. But that should be the exception rather than the rule. And I think what happened with differentiation is that became the norm, lots of different tasks, where actually now the norm for us in our schools is more about differentiation by scaffolding, aiming high for all learners. And I think that very much fits with a lot of the stuff that's gone on with mastery and whatnot in the last few years. So Steve, we come to our final thoughts, hopefully closing just within a couple of minutes time. At the end of the book, we try to summarize just the amazing difference you make as teachers all day, every day, coming full circle to those principles that Jazz Ampafar spoke about. Steve, do you want to share this little extract that we wrote?
Absolutely. You are part of the most incredible profession in the world, and what you do for young people each and every day is quite astonishing. Due to you today, a child may well have smiled, laughed, become wiser, developed more empathy, understood a concept, felt loved, felt supported, felt special, grown in self-belief, been able to express their feelings for the very first time. This list could go on, but thank you for being everyday heroes.
And thank you now for coming along and listening to us for an hour speak, and for being everyday heroes that are making an enormous difference in your schools day in, day out. I'm going to finish with a quick reminder of how you can connect to us if you do want to reach out and say hello. We love getting to know other teachers in the profession. I'm based in the Southwest and happy to talk to any of you and meet any of you and welcome you to my school if you ever want to come along and say hello. And I know Steve's just as happy to be spoken to online. Obviously, we've got a book coming out. It is available on pre-order on Amazon. If you don't want to buy it, that's absolutely fine. If you want to follow the podcast, that would be awesome. Yeah. So it's called the Dynamic Deputies Podcast. And if you just Google it, you can find it anywhere. It is hosted on SoundCloud, but you can find it anywhere. Just Dynamic Deputies Podcast and it will come up. You're more than welcome to email me there on my Willowbrook email, which is rpearson@willowbrook.devon.sch.uk. You can find us on Instagram, which we don't really understand, but we try, and Twitter on @DynamicDeps. And then, of course, we have our Facebook group, which is called the Dynamic Deputies Facebook group. So
and even if anyone disappears now and then has a question, just message us and we'll gladly get back to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to stop share and hand over to you, Robin,